The diner went completely dark. Not a flicker. Total blackout. And in the 3 seconds before the screaming started, Wesley Kane was already moving. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. His hand found the little girl's shoulder in the darkness before her mother even registered what was happening. 8 years old, alone, and he'd already put his body between her and the front windows. Celeste Armitage had spent 2 years believing money could protect her daughter from anything. She was wrong. And the quiet man in the faded work jacket, the stranger her daughter had chosen without explanation, was the only reason they both walked out of that diner alive. If this is your first time here, welcome, and please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a story. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now stay with me, because this one is only just beginning. The booth in the far corner of Manny's diner was the kind of table nobody chose voluntarily. It sat wedged between the service corridor and the emergency exit, perpetually in the path of kitchen noise and the sharp smell of dish soap that never fully dissipated no matter what the health inspector suggested. The overhead light above it had been flickering on and off for 3 weeks. The vinyl seat had a long crack down the center that the management kept meaning to patch with electrical tape and kept forgetting. Wesley Kane had been sitting there for 40 minutes. He'd ordered coffee, a short stack, and nothing else. The waitress, a heavy-set woman named Darlene, who had been working the Thursday night shift at Manny's for 11 years, had refilled his cup twice without being asked, because she recognized the particular quality of his silence. Not unfriendly, just contained, like a man who had learned a long time ago how to take up very little space. "You want the check?" she asked on her second pass. "Not yet," he said. She didn't push it. Darlene had a talent for reading people, and what she read from Wesley Kane was not loneliness exactly, more like a man who was comfortable being still in a way that most people weren't anymore. He was staring at the seat across from him. It was empty. It had been empty for 4 years, in every room of every place Wesley Kane spent time in, and he had long since stopped pretending that didn't mean something. Tessa was at science camp upstate, gone for the week, and the apartment had felt so quiet when he left it that evening that he'd driven around for 20 minutes before pulling into Manny's parking lot without having decided to do so. There was a routine in that. Thursday evenings, when Tessa wasn't home, he ended up here. Same corner table, same short stack. He wasn't sure when it had started, but he suspected it had something to do with the fact that Lauren had loved diners. The cheap ones, the ones that smelled like coffee and old cooking oil. And sitting in one was the closest thing he had to a version of company that didn't require explanation. He was not a man who talked about that. He was not, if he was honest, a man who talked about much. The diner was busy for a Thursday. A long week of October cold had driven people indoors, and Manny's had the kind of comfortable shabbiness that made it feel warmer than it actually was. Wesley had been watching the room without meaning to, an old habit, as involuntary as breathing, tracking the door, the windows, the positions of the tables, the way the foot traffic moved. He wasn't doing it consciously. His brain had just never learned to stop. He noticed the woman the moment she came through the door. It would have been difficult not to. She was striking, tall, with dark hair pulled back at the neck, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Wesley's monthly rent. But that wasn't what caught his attention. What caught his attention was the way she moved. Efficient and purposeful, like someone who had learned to compress time because time was always being demanded of her from every direction. She was holding the hand of a small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with the same dark hair and an expression that was watching the room with careful, measuring eyes. The child looked like someone who had learned to be cautious. Wesley recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror on Tessa, after. The woman scanned for a table and found nothing immediately available. The hostess, a college-age kid who looked mildly overwhelmed, was talking to 3 different parties simultaneously and not managing any of them particularly well. The woman in the expensive coat waited with controlled patience, the kind that looks calm on the outside while the jaw muscles do a lot of quiet work. Wesley went back to his coffee. He heard a moment later the sound of small footsteps. He looked up. The girl was standing beside his table. She was looking at him with the direct, unself-conscious focus that children sometimes have when they haven't yet fully absorbed the adult conventions about strangers. Brown eyes. A small gap where she'd recently lost a tooth. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves pushed up, and she had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm that had clearly been through a considerable amount of living. "Can we sit with you?" she asked. Wesley stared at her. Behind her, the mother was already moving. "Audrey, come back here. You can't just—" But the girl didn't move. She just kept looking at him with that steady, patient gaze, as if she was completely certain of the answer and was simply waiting for him to catch up. Wesley looked at the empty seat across from him. He looked back at the girl. "Sure, kiddo," he said. Celeste Armitage had not planned for this. She had not planned for any of this evening, if she was being precise about it. The meeting with her legal team had run 40 minutes over. Her regular driver had called out sick. The replacement driver had taken a wrong turn twice and then run a yellow light so aggressively that Celeste had told him to stop the car and let her out 6 blocks from the office. She'd intended to take a car service home. Then Audrey had asked if they could walk, and the October cold was actually pleasant in the way October sometimes is, and Celeste had said yes because she'd been saying no to things all day and was tired of the sound of it. They'd ended up in front of Manny's because Audrey liked the neon sign. That was the whole reason, a child's preference for colored light. And now her daughter was sitting down across from a stranger in a diner corner booth, completely unperturbed, tucking the stuffed rabbit, Gerald, who had been with Audrey since she was 3, carefully against the wall beside her. Celeste sat down because the alternative was making a scene, and she had spent enough of her adult life being stared at in public. "I'm sorry," she said to the man, keeping her voice low and professionally neutral. "She does this sometimes. We'll find another table when—" "It's fine," the man said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Audrey, who was already examining the laminated menu with the focused intensity of someone conducting an audit. Celeste looked at him more carefully. 30s, maybe late 30s, blue-gray eyes that were quietly alert in a way she couldn't entirely account for. A face that had some weather in it. Not from vanity, not affected roughness, just actual outdoor time and years. The jacket was faded canvas, the kind mechanics wore, and his hands around the coffee cup were rough at the knuckles in a way that came from real work. There was a small scar along his left jaw, barely visible in the diner light, that curved in a way she associated, without knowing precisely why, with something that hadn't been an accident. He was not the sort of man Celeste Armitage typically sat across a table from. "Celeste," she said, because the silence had stretched to the point where it needed filling. She didn't offer her last name. "Wesley," he said. Audrey looked up from the menu. "I'm Audrey. I like your jacket." Wesley glanced down at it. "It's seen better days." "That's okay. Gerald's stuffing is coming out his ear, and I still think he's perfect." Wesley looked at the rabbit. "How old is he?" 5 years, 4 months, and, Audrey considered, approximately 2 weeks. "Good math." "I'm good at math," Audrey said, with the complete absence of false modesty that children sometimes manage. "My mom is too, but she pretends she's not. So people don't feel bad." Celeste pressed her lips together. "Audrey." "It's true." Wesley said nothing, but something around his eyes shifted in a way that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. Celeste had spent 2 years working very hard to keep Audrey close and safe and surrounded by good things. After Daniel died, a cardiac event at 41, no warning, no sense in it, just gone, she had rebuilt everything around the fact of her daughter. She'd restructured her schedule, relocated her primary office, transferred Audrey to a school 3 blocks from the building so she could see her at lunch if the day allowed it. She'd hired the best child psychologist in Manhattan, then a second one when the first proved too detached, then a third who Audrey actually seemed to tolerate. She'd done everything she could think of to give Audrey stability and security and the sense that the world was not made entirely of sudden disappearances. What she had not been able to give Audrey was easy trust. Audrey had become careful with people, watchful. She was warm once she knew someone, fiercely, completely warm, but getting there required time and a level of familiarity that didn't come easily anymore. The pediatric grief counselor had explained this gently as a normal response. Children who lose a parent early sometimes become protective of their emotional investment. They don't spend it carelessly. Audrey had not so much as asked to sit next to a stranger in 2 years. Celeste sat across from Wesley Kane and tried to understand what her daughter was seeing that she wasn't. Audrey was telling him about science camp, not hers, Celeste had never heard about a science camp. Some camp that a friend of hers had gone to, and what they'd done there, and whether Wesley had ever built anything with circuits because Audrey thought she might be interested in circuits. Some, Wesley said. What did you make? A pause. Things I had to take apart again pretty quickly. Audrey seemed to find this a satisfying answer. I made a thing once that my mom said looked like a fire hazard. Was it? A little bit, Audrey admitted. Audrey, Celeste said. It was only slightly on fire. Wesley's mouth did the thing again. This time it completed the journey to something that was genuinely a smile, brief and a little rusty, like something that didn't get used at the usual rate. He had the expression of a man who found things funnier than he let on, and had made a private decision some years back, not to let on. Celeste felt something shift very slightly in her chest that she did not examine. She noticed him notice the man at the counter approximately 20 minutes after they sat down. It was subtle. She almost missed it. A slight change in the quality of his attention, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. He didn't turn his head. His eyes moved in a way that suggested he was looking at a reflection in the window rather than directly across the room. Something wrong? She asked, low enough that Audrey wouldn't catch it. Probably nothing, Wesley said. But, he picked up his coffee cup. The man at the end of the counter, gray jacket, he's been watching you since we sat down. Celeste didn't look. She had trained herself years ago not to react visibly to information before she'd assessed it. I have a security detail, 2-person rotation. I know, Wesley said. They were outside when you came in. Dark sedan, 2 men. Celeste went still. Were, she said. They've been gone about 7 minutes. She made herself count to 3 before she turned her head to look toward the window. The space where the sedan had been was empty. The street was ordinary. Foot traffic, a food delivery cyclist, a cab. Nothing alarming in any visible way. You've been watching us since we came in, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact offered for clarification. I watch rooms, Wesley said. It's a habit, not personal. How did you know they were my security? He set the cup down. The way they positioned themselves, sight lines. They were protecting someone specific, not just keeping an eye on a parking spot. He paused. You should call whoever manages your detail and find out where they went. Celeste was already reaching for her phone. She got a voicemail. She tried the second number. Voicemail again. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the October temperature. Across the table, Audrey was explaining to Gerald why the chocolate milkshake was always the correct choice, conducting the argument with thorough conviction, completely unaware that anything had changed. Wesley, Celeste said, and she heard it in her own voice, the careful flatness that took effort. I need to make another call, and I need you to— I know, he said. He was already watching the room. The man in the gray jacket had moved from the counter. He was standing near the front door. Outside, pulling into the space recently vacated by the sedan, a dark SUV had stopped with its engine running. But Celeste leaned forward. What is this? She said quietly. I don't know yet. Wesley's voice was absolutely level. Do you have anything on you that someone would want? The question landed with a particular weight. She did. An encrypted external drive in her coat's interior pocket. The kind of device that contained, among other things, 2 years of financial documentation she'd spent 14 months quietly and carefully assembling. Evidence that one of her most senior executives had been siphoning funds through a series of fraudulent defense subcontracts. She'd been carrying it because she had a meeting the following morning with a federal investigator, and she had not wanted it left in the office another night. She had told no one that she was carrying it, or so she'd believed. Yes, she said. Something crossed Wesley's face that was not quite expression, a tightening, a reading of information. He looked at the door, at the man in the gray jacket, at the window and the idling SUV, and then back at Audrey, who had moved on from Gerald and was now reorganizing the sugar packets by color with the serious focus of someone doing important work. The kitchen will have a service exit, he said. When I stand up, you're going to pick up your daughter, keep her close, and follow me. Don't run. Normal pace. You don't have to— I know, he said again. He was looking at Audrey when he said it. He stood up. The lights went out. The darkness was instantaneous and total, and for 1/2 second everything in Manny's diner stopped. The conversations, the clatter from the kitchen, even the background music from the old speaker system mounted above the register. And then the screaming started, and the sound of people lurching out of chairs and knocking into tables, and glass breaking somewhere near the front of the room. Celeste grabbed Audrey. Audrey made a small, frightened sound and grabbed back. She could feel Audrey's hands fisted in her coat, could feel the way her daughter pressed against her side, small and rigid with the effort of not making more sound than that one brief noise. "I've got you," Celeste said. "I've got you, baby. It's okay." "Mom." Audrey's voice was very small and very controlled. "The man from the table. Where is he?" And then Wesley's hand was on Celeste's arm, steady, certain, no hesitation. And his voice was just above a whisper. "This way, Audrey. I need you to hold on to my jacket and not let go. Can you do that?" "Yes," Audrey said. "Good girl." They moved. In the darkness, through the noise and the confusion of a room full of frightened people, Wesley Kane navigated them toward the kitchen corridor with the practiced, unhurried certainty of someone who had memorized the geometry of the room the moment he walked into it. He redirected two panicking customers away from the front windows with a word and a hand on the shoulder, calm, authoritative, no volume, and kept moving. Celeste matched his pace and kept Audrey pressed against her side and did not ask questions because something in the quality of his certainty told her that now was not the time. In her interior pocket, the encrypted drive pressed against her ribs. Ahead, the faint red glow of an emergency exit sign bled through the darkness at the end of the service corridor. Behind them, the front door opened with a crash. Wesley's grip on her arm tightened once, briefly, then released. "Almost there," he said. "Keep moving." The service corridor behind Manny's kitchen smelled like old grease and standing water and the particular sourness of a drain that needed attention. The floor was slick in places. Wesley felt it before he saw it and adjusted his grip on the wall without breaking pace. Behind him, Celeste was moving well. Better than he'd expected, actually. No hesitation, no unnecessary noise, no pulling against his direction. She'd assessed the situation and made a decision to trust his lead, and she was executing on that decision cleanly. Audrey had not let go of his jacket. He could feel her small fist twisted into the canvas at his lower back, steady and determined, moving exactly when he moved. She hadn't made another sound since the lights went out. That kind of controlled quiet in an 8-year-old was not ordinary. It spoke to something in her, either unusual temperament or the kind of early experience with fear that taught children to go still and wait it out. He didn't know which yet. He wasn't sure it mattered right now. The emergency exit was 15 feet ahead. The push bar was visible in the dim bleed of the exit sign, and Wesley slowed his pace by half a step and listened. The corridor had one turn before the door. Around that turn, he could hear, faint, but there, the sound of movement. Not the panicked shuffling of kitchen staff finding their way out in the dark. Something more deliberate than that. 2 sets of feet, maybe 3, positioned near the rear exit. They'd expected this route. Wesley stopped. He put one hand back and found Celeste's arm, applied light pressure. Stop. And felt her halt immediately. Good. He leaned close to the wall and thought for 2 seconds, which was longer than it felt and longer than he usually needed. The front of the diner was compromised. The rear exit was covered. The kitchen itself had a loading bay access on the north side. He'd clocked it when Darlene walked him past on his second refill, the kitchen door swinging open briefly to reveal a wedge of outside light and the edge of a corrugated metal door that rolled up. Loading bays typically had a service alley. Service alleys typically ran to a cross street. He turned back to Celeste and put his mouth close to her ear. "There's a loading bay through the kitchen. We're going left." "There are people in the kitchen," she said. "Staff." "I know. Stay behind me." He didn't wait for agreement. He moved left, back through the kitchen entry, and the kitchen was a kind of organized chaos. Emergency lights had kicked on somewhere, casting everything in a flat, yellowish pallor that made the stainless steel surfaces look strange and institutional. 3-line cooks were clustered near the pass-through, talking urgently in Spanish, one of them on a cell phone. A young dishwasher was standing motionless near his station with the particular frozen quality of someone who has not yet decided what to do with their hands. Wesley moved through without stopping. Loading bay. Is it unlocked? One of the cooks, older, thick-armed, with the wary expression of someone who had seen a range of events in his time, looked at Wesley and then at Celeste and Audrey behind him. "Should be," the cook said. "Thank you." The loading bay door was not, in fact, unlocked. It was secured with a sliding bolt that had been painted over sometime in the last decade and had adhered partially to its housing. Wesley hit it with the heel of his hand twice, and it gave on the second strike with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Audrey flinched but held on. He got the door up by about 4 feet. The mechanism was stiff and grinding, and dropped under it without hesitation, turning immediately to take Audrey from Celeste's arms and set her down on the other side, then holding the door while Celeste came through. The alley was narrow and smelled like wet cardboard, and the previous night's restaurant garbage from the Italian place 2 doors down. A sodium light above a neighboring exit cast everything in orange. Wesley let the door down behind them, slowly, to avoid noise, and stood for a moment reading the alley in both directions. Left ran toward a cross street with visible foot traffic. Right dead-ended at a chain-link fence. "Left," he said, and they moved. They came out onto West 46th Street into the ordinary noise of a Thursday evening in Midtown. Cabs, voices, a bus pulling away from the curb, the smell of roasting nuts from a cart on the corner. And the sheer normalcy of it felt briefly disorienting after the dark and the close walls of the corridor. Wesley kept them moving for half a block before he pulled them into the recessed doorway of a closed dry cleaner and stopped. Audrey was breathing fast but quiet. She still had her rabbit. Celeste was pale in the sodium orange light, and she had her hand pressed flat against her coat at the interior pocket, a reflex she probably wasn't aware of, and her jaw was doing the careful, controlled tension thing he'd noticed earlier. She was frightened. She wasn't going to say so. "You okay?" he asked Audrey. Audrey looked up at him. Her eyes were very large and very serious. "Gerald is okay," she said. "I checked." "Good. That's the important thing." Audrey almost smiled. It was small and slightly shaky, but it was real. Wesley looked at Celeste. "You need to reach someone, not your security team's main line, someone who can get a physical response to your location in under 10 minutes. Do you have that?" Celeste was already scrolling through her phone with fingers that were steadier than they had any right to be. "My security director, he's retired Navy, he has—" She stopped. "I don't know if I should be trusting my phone right now." It was a good instinct. "Use mine," Wesley said, and handed it over. She looked at it briefly, a several-years-old model with a cracked corner on the screen, and then looked at him. "You're going to want to explain who you are at some point," she said. "I know. But not right now." "No," he agreed. "Not right now." She dialed from memory, which told him something about her, and turned slightly away to speak. Wesley watched the street. Nothing alarming yet. No dark SUVs rolling slow, no men in gray jackets materializing from doorways. Whoever had been at the rear exit was either still there or had gone back to regroup, and he thought they'd have maybe 10 minutes before somebody made a decision about next steps. He looked down at Audrey. She was watching him with that same focused, undeflectable attention she'd fixed on him back at the corner table when she'd walked up to a stranger and asked if she could sit down. He still wasn't sure what to make of that. Children sometimes picked up things adults talked themselves out of noticing. They hadn't yet learned the social convention of deciding someone was ordinary before they'd actually confirmed it. "Are you a police?" Audrey asked. "No." "Are you a soldier?" He paused for a fraction too long. "Not anymore." Audrey considered this. "My dad was a lawyer," she said. "He didn't have to be strong. He was just really good at arguing." She looked at the street. "Mom says he could argue a jury into believing the sky was green." "She's probably right." "He died," Audrey said. It wasn't said with drama. It was just the simple fact of it, stated clearly in the way that children sometimes state things that adults have learned to wrap in careful language. 2 years ago. His heart stopped. "I'm sorry." Audrey looked at him. "Your wife?" He didn't answer immediately. "Yeah," he said. "How long ago?" 4 years. Audrey nodded slowly, absorbing this with the same serious focus she brought to menu analysis and sugar packet organization. "Is that why you sit in the corner by yourself?" Wesley looked at her. "Sometimes," he said. Audrey seemed to find this honest enough. She tucked Gerald more firmly under her arm and went back to watching the street. Malcolm Stroud arrived in 11 minutes. He came in a black town car with a second vehicle behind it. Two men Wesley didn't recognize, both with the particular physical vocabulary of people who had done security work for long enough that it had become architectural, built into how they stood and where their eyes went. Stroud himself was 60-something, white-haired, with the upright bearing of a career naval officer that no amount of civilian life fully eroded. He moved through the sidewalk crowd with a kind of purposeful economy that Wesley recognized instantly. He also recognized the way Stroud stopped dead the moment his eyes found Wesley. A full stop. Not the hesitation of someone encountering an unexpected face. The full stop of someone encountering a face they had specifically not expected to ever encounter again. "Lieutenant Kane," Stroud said. The title landed on the sidewalk between them like something physical. Celeste turned from Wesley to Stroud and back to Wesley with the expression of someone recalibrating rapidly. Wesley held Stroud's gaze. "Commander, it's been a while." "8 years," Stroud said. "About that." Stroud looked at him for another long moment, assessing, recalibrating his own version of the situation, and then seemed to make a decision and move on. "Are you two intact?" "We're fine," Celeste said. Her voice had gone very precise. "Malcolm, I need you to tell me what happened to my detail tonight. Both of them. No contact." Stroud's expression shifted. "I got the notification 14 minutes ago. Richards went down with what they're calling a sudden medical event. They're saying it looks like he was dosed, something fast-acting. Chen hasn't been located yet." The word settled over the group with a particular weight. Dosed. Someone had taken out her security team deliberately, which meant this had not been opportunistic. Not someone who happened to see a wealthy woman unprotected and decided to try something. This had been planned, timed. "The drive," Wesley said. Celeste looked at him. "They knew you had it," he said. "They knew tonight was the handoff." "I haven't told anyone about the meeting tomorrow, not even my assistant." "Someone knew." She pressed her hand flat against the interior pocket again, that same unconscious gesture. Then she straightened and dropped her hand deliberately, refusing the tell. "We need to move somewhere secure." "Malcolm." "I have a location," Stroud said. "Company safe room, 12 blocks. I'd like to get you there in the next 5 minutes." He glanced at Wesley. "Lieutenant, I'm going to ask you to come with us, if you're willing." "I'm a maintenance worker," Wesley said. It wasn't a denial. It was the sentence of a man who had made a careful accounting of who he currently was and what he had decided his life looked like, stated plainly for the record. "I know what you are," Stroud said. "I also know what you were. And I know that whatever just happened back there," he tilted his head toward the direction of the diner, "went the way it did because of the second one." He paused. "You don't have to be anything you're not. I'm just asking you not to walk away yet." Wesley said nothing for several seconds. Audrey had moved to stand beside him without fanfare, her shoulder against his arm, watching Stroud with the evaluating eyes she applied to everything. "He's like you," she told Wesley. "He stands the same way." Stroud looked at her with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Not many people caught that in him, Wesley suspected. And then a brief, reluctant expression that was close to appreciation. "Your daughter?" Stroud asked Wesley. "No," Wesley said. "She just sat down at my table." The safe room was on the 14th floor of a building in the West 40s that presented itself to the world as a mid-tier consulting firm and had, behind a correctly coded access panel on the interior, a suite of rooms that Celeste's security infrastructure maintained for exactly this kind of contingency. It was professionally equipped, secure communications, a medical kit, a small kitchen area, several rooms with actual walls rather than open-plan configurations. And Celeste moved through it with the ease of someone who had been briefed on it thoroughly but hoped she'd never use it. Audrey. Once it became clear that the immediate danger had passed, and that this new location had a couch, a television, and what appeared to be a substantial snack inventory, downgraded her alert status considerably. She was installed on the couch with Gerald and a bag of pretzels while Stroud's people worked the phones in the adjacent room. Celeste sat at the table across from Wesley and looked at him without preamble. "Malcolm called you lieutenant." "He did." "Navy." "Yes." She waited. He didn't elaborate, and she recognized, with the instinct of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where people controlled information strategically, that he wasn't going to fill the silence out of discomfort. He'd wait her out indefinitely. So she changed her approach. My husband was on the board of a defense foundation, she said. He knew officers. I've attended enough events to understand what certain ranks mean in practice. She folded her hands on the table. Lieutenant, in the context of the unit structure Malcolm would have known, means something specific. Wesley said nothing. Theo, she said. Still nothing, which was, in its own way, confirmation. Celeste sat back. She was trying to reconcile the man who had shared a corner booth and listened to her daughter explain the superiority of chocolate milkshakes with the man who had moved 2 adult civilians and 1 child through a blacked-out building and out a service alley without raising his voice once. The gap between those 2 images was significant. She'd spent time around decorated veterans, private contractors, men who wore their training like a costume they were always slightly performing in. Wesley wore nothing. He'd sat in that corner like a man whose most urgent problem was deciding whether to order a second cup of coffee. "Why the maintenance work?" she asked. He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm good at fixing things," he said, "and it doesn't follow me home." "What did you do before?" A long pause. "Complicated things. In places you wouldn't find on a standard news cycle. And you left." "I left? Why?" He looked across the room to where Audrey was methodically working through the pretzels, narrating something quietly to Gerald about the structural integrity of the bag's reseal function. "Tessa was 5, he said, and Lauren had just died, and I was the only one left." The sentence was entirely without self-pity, which somehow made it more weighted than it would have been otherwise. Celeste was quiet for a moment. "How old is she now?" 9. She's at science camp this week." "Does she know what you did?" "She knows her dad was in the Navy. She doesn't need the rest of it. Not yet." He paused. "Maybe not ever." Celeste understood the impulse. She had her own version of it. The decisions she made about what Audrey knew, what Audrey was shielded from. The careful architecture of a childhood constructed around a fundamental loss. The difference was that Celeste's concealment was a financial empire and its complications, and Wesley's was something that had apparently involved classified operations in locations that didn't make the news. Both of them were parents who had decided their children deserved normal lives more than they deserved the full truth of what their surviving parent had been through. Whether that was wisdom or fear was a question she hadn't fully answered for herself. "The drive," Wesley said. "How long have you been building that case?" Back to the operational facts. She appreciated the shift. 14 months. Victor Hale, he's my chief operations officer, or was, has been running a secondary financial structure through 3 shell companies. Defense subcontracts, all fraudulent. The contracts are real, but the work was either never performed or was massively overbilled, with the surplus routed back through a network of holding entities he controls. How much? Confirmed, across the 14 months, 47 million. My forensic accountant thinks the actual total over the 5 years he's been with the company is closer to 160. Wesley's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "And you were taking this to federal investigators?" "Tomorrow morning. The meeting was arranged 2 weeks ago through an intermediary. I didn't contact the investigator directly. I didn't use company channels. I didn't tell anyone in my office." She paused. "I told my attorney, under privilege. And I told Daniel's brother, who sits on the company's board, both of whom I trust entirely. And yet someone knew," she said. She heard the brittleness in her own voice and reined it in. This was the part that had kept her up 3 nights running. Not the fear of what had happened tonight, but the smaller, quieter wrongness of the leak itself. Someone she trusted had told someone she shouldn't have, or someone she trusted had been gotten to. Both possibilities were their own kind of damage. Wesley was quiet, working through something. "Hale," he said finally. "What's his background? Before your company?" "Defense consulting. A decade of it, working with military contractors primarily on the acquisition side." "Which contractors?" Celeste named several. She watched Wesley's face carefully as she did. At the third name, something shifted. It was small, a tensing at the jawline, a very slight adjustment in how he was sitting, and it was gone in under a second. But she caught it. "You know that name," she said. He looked at her. "Wesley, you know that company?" He was quiet for long enough that she almost repeated herself. Then he said carefully, If it's the same organization, and I'm not certain it is, then what you're describing isn't limited to one COO running a personal scheme. That contractor has been connected to a broader network for at least 6 years. He stopped. Amended. There were people who spent significant time trying to establish that connection. Officially, nothing ever came of it. And unofficially? Unofficially, 2 people I served with believed they were close to something substantial. One of them left the service 18 months later, the circumstances of which I was never given a satisfactory explanation for. He paused. The other one is buried in Arlington. The room was very quiet for a moment. From the other room, Audrey's voice carried faintly. Gerald, I'm telling you, the reseal strip is a lie they tell you. It never works. It's a design flaw. Celeste looked at Wesley. You think this is bigger than one company's fraud? I think it's possible, he said. I think the fact that they moved tonight, that they knew about your meeting, that they took out your security team, suggests they have reached that a single corrupt executive doesn't explain. Celeste sat with that for a moment. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had built a company from a $30 million inheritance into something worth 12 times that, and she had done it in an industry where being underestimated was a professional hazard. She'd turned into a consistent advantage. She'd sat across from difficult men in difficult rooms and maintained the upper hand through preparation and refusal to let her expression do things she hadn't authorized. But the thing about being competent and controlled in the face of a known threat was that it required knowing the threat. What Wesley was describing was a threat with unknown dimensions. That was different. So the drive I'm carrying, she said slowly, might be the edge of something much larger. Maybe. I don't know enough to say for certain. But you know enough to say maybe. Yes. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He seemed mildly surprised by the question. What do you mean? You spent 8 years not telling anyone anything. You walked away from all of it deliberately. You sat in a corner booth in a diner on Thursday nights because it was quiet. You had no reason to walk back into any of this. She held his gaze. Why? Wesley looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at this couch, where Audrey had apparently concluded the pretzel bag analysis and moved on to a careful examination of the television remote, testing each button with the methodical patience of a quality assurance professional. She came and sat down, he said. It was not a complete answer, but Celeste understood, in the way that one parent understands another, that it was the true one. Well, Stroud came back in at 10:30 with his expression set in the particular configuration that meant the news was complicated. Chen was found, he said. He's okay. They had him in a vehicle 3 blocks from the diner. They were holding him. Police have him now. Richards is in the hospital. Whatever they gave him is metabolizing. Doctors say he'll be fine. He set a tablet on the table. The men from the diners, 2 were apprehended at the scene when uniforms responded. A 3rd one got out. Hale? Celeste asked. Not at his residence. His assistant says he left the office at 4 and didn't come back. His personal phone is going to voicemail. Stroud looked at Wesley. I put in a call to someone I know at the agency, gave them the contractor name you mentioned. They're going to make some inquiries. A pause that had weight in it. Quietly. Wesley said nothing. Lieutenant, don't, Wesley said. It wasn't aggressive, just flat and final. Whatever you're about to ask me, don't. Stroud held his hands up slightly. I'm not asking you to come back to anything. I'm asking you whether, in the next 72 hours, you'd be willing to sit in a room with a federal investigator and share what you know about that contractor and its connections, informally, off the record, if that's how you want it. I'm a maintenance worker, Wesley said again. And you can keep being one after Thursday, Stroud said. I'm asking for 3 days. Wesley looked at the table. From the couch. Mom, this remote has 19 buttons, and I've only figured out what 11 of them do. I think the other 8 might be decorative. Celeste almost laughed. She felt it rise in her chest and pushed it back down. Because if she started laughing, she was not entirely certain she'd be able to stop. And there were several other things she might start doing alongside the laughing that she did not have the energy or the privacy for right now. It's not decorative, she called back. The manual is probably in the drawer under the TV. A pause. Then the sound of a drawer opening. There is no manual, Audrey reported. There is 1 pen, 1 very old receipt, and what might be a button from a coat. I'll leave it for the investigators. Wesley's mouth did the thing again. That brief, rusty, almost smile. Stroud watched him with the patient expression of a man who had learned long ago that the most effective recruiting tool was simply waiting. "I have a daughter," Wesley said, to no one in particular, and to both of them simultaneously. "She comes home from camp on Sunday." "I know," Stroud said. "This doesn't go past Thursday. Whatever room you need me in, whatever I can tell them. It ends Thursday, and then I go back to work on Friday." "Understood." Wesley was quiet for another moment. He looked at the ceiling, briefly, in the manner of someone checking something internal. Then he looked at Stroud. "The contractor," he said. "The network I told you about. There was a name that came up 3 times in the last 8 months of my service. Every time someone got close to something, this name appeared in the periphery. It was never in any file, never official, just a name that people said quietly and then stopped saying." He paused. "If Hale is connected to these people the way I think he might be, that name is going to come up in your investigators' files too. And when it does, you need to make sure they understand what they're dealing with." Stroud leaned forward. "What's the name?" Wesley told him. Stroud's expression shifted in a way that confirmed, without confirming, that the name was not unknown to him. Across the room, Audrey had given up on the remote buttons and curled up on the couch with Gerald tucked under her chin, her eyes growing heavy at the edges despite her evident intention to remain fully operational. Celeste watched her daughter begin the slow drift towards sleep and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite peace, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. The specific sensation of a crisis still unresolved but survivable, of having gotten through the worst hour with her daughter intact, of being in a room with people who knew what they were doing. She looked across the table at Wesley Kane, who was talking quietly with Stroud, laying out what he knew in the careful, economical way of someone who had been trained to make information useful, and she thought about what he'd said. She came and sat down. It was, she thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to her in recent memory. Not decorated, not managed, just the plain fact of why a man who had spent 8 years walking away from everything had chosen, in one particular moment in one particular diner, to stay. Outside, the city continued in its ordinary noise, cabs and voices and the faint complaint of a bus braking at the corner, entirely indifferent to what had happened and what was still unfolding. Tomorrow, Celeste would need to make decisions about the meeting, about the drive, about her company, and the people in it she had trusted and might no longer be able to. Tonight, her daughter was asleep on a safe room couch with a stuffed rabbit and 11 out of 19 remote buttons identified, and the man across the table knew things that no maintenance worker should know, and somehow that was the situation. Audrey's breathing had gone slow and even. Wesley glanced over at her. A brief look, not lingering, just checking. Then he went back to Stroud. But Celeste had seen the look. She recognized it. It was the look of a parent taking inventory. The involuntary, perpetual accounting that you never turned off. The one that asked, is she okay? Is she warm? Is she breathing right? Without any conscious decision to ask. She did it herself 40 times a day. Had done it more probably, since Daniel. She didn't know what to do with the fact that a stranger was doing it for her daughter. She filed it alongside the other things she didn't know what to do with, which was a file that had been growing steadily since approximately the moment Audrey had walked up to a corner booth and asked a man she'd never met if they could sit with him. She supposed she'd sort through it all eventually. For now, she reached across to the couch and adjusted the cushion under Audrey's head, and Audrey made a small, unconscious sound and pulled Gerald tighter, and Celeste sat back in her chair and listened to the 2 former naval men at the table talk through the shape of a problem that was both older and larger than any of them had walked into that evening expecting. Audrey slept through most of it. That was something, at least. She slept with the complete, unguarded depth that children manage when their bodies decide the emergency is over, regardless of what the adults in the room are still working through, curled into the corner of the safe room couch, with Gerald pressed against her collarbone and one shoe half off her foot. Celeste had covered her with a jacket she'd found in the closet, navy blue, too large, smelling faintly of someone else's cologne, and Audrey had not stirred. Wesley watched her sleep for approximately 3 seconds before looking away, because it was not his business, and because the looking felt too much like something he recognized from the first years after Lauren, when he'd stood in Tessa's doorway at odd hours just confirming her continued existence. He didn't examine why seeing Audrey asleep produced that same specific feeling. He filed it alongside the growing list of things about this evening he was going to have to think about later, when there was time and distance, and Tessa was home from camp, and the orderly shape of his actual life had reasserted itself. Stroud had gone into the adjacent room to work his phone contacts and give Wesley space, which was either tactical consideration or genuine courtesy. Probably both, since Stroud had always been good at using kindness as a tool without the kindness being any less real for it. That was a quality Wesley had always respected and been slightly wary of simultaneously. Celeste was at the table with her laptop open, working through something with the focused, slightly grim efficiency of a person who has accepted that sleep is not happening and has decided to be productive about it. She'd called her attorney, brief, coded, giving location and status without specifics, and then her company's chief financial officer, a woman named Rourke, whom she described afterward as difficult and completely trustworthy, which is a combination I have come to value enormously. She'd been on the phone for the better part of an hour, and Wesley had noted without surprise that she was entirely competent in crisis. She didn't catastrophize. She didn't perform calm either. She was just functional, which was rarer than it should have been. Now she was cross-referencing something on her laptop with a set of financial documents Rourke had sent through the secure connection, and her reading glasses were on, round-framed, slightly incongruous against the expensive coat. The kind of glasses a person wore when they'd stopped caring what they looked like and started caring about what they could see. And she had a pen behind one ear that she'd forgotten was there. Wesley got up and went to the small kitchen area and found coffee supplies. He made a pot because it seemed like the useful thing to do, and because he'd been sitting still long enough that he needed something to do with his hands. "Black," Celeste said without looking up. He brought her a cup. She took it without ceremony, eyes still on the screen, and drank half of it before she spoke again. "Victor Hale started at the company 6 years ago," she said. "He came with excellent references. 2 prior positions, both in defense-adjacent consulting, passed every background check." "Background checks look for what's on record," Wesley said. "I know that now." She turned the laptop slightly so he could see the screen. Rourke found something in the third quarter filings from 4 years back, a consulting fee paid to one of the shell companies that at the time was reviewed and approved as legitimate. It was structured to look like market rate consulting on a procurement assessment, but the company it was paid to, she tapped the screen, was incorporated 8 months before Hale joined, before he would have had any relationship with my company. Wesley looked at the document. He set up the infrastructure before he got the job. Which means he wasn't recruited and then went corrupt. He came in already connected. The job was the mechanism. She sat back and took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. "I hired him. I sat across a table from him in an interview, and I thought he was sharp and organized and appropriately ambitious, and I hired him. He had good references and a clean record, and he'd been doing this for years before he walked into your office," Wesley said. "You didn't miss something you should have caught." She looked at him. "I appreciate that. I don't entirely believe it." "You're allowed to not believe it. It's still true." She was quiet for a moment, turning the pen over in her fingers. She'd noticed it behind her ear and pulled it out, and was now using it as a thinking prop, clicking the end in a pattern that was probably unconscious. "The contractor," she said. "The one you recognized. What was your actual involvement?" Wesley sat down across from her. He thought about how much to say, did the calculation he always did, which was not about whether to trust her, because the question of trust was almost beside the point at this stage, but about which information was his to share and which belonged to people who weren't in this room. There was a version of events that was his, and a version that intersected with operations and individuals that carried their own weight of classification and professional obligation even 8 years removed. "I led a team," he said. "We were tasked with tracking a money network that was funding adversarial procurement, basically state and non-state actors acquiring defense technology through back channels. Legitimate contractors as cover. The work moved slowly because the financial trails were extremely sophisticated, and because every time we got traction, something happened." "What kind of something?" "Information went wrong, sources dried up. Once, a warrant application that should have been processed in 3 days sat in review for 11 weeks, and by the time it moved, the accounts it targeted had been emptied and restructured." He paused. "We started to understand that the network had people inside the process, not just in the contracting structure, inside the oversight, inside the military. Adjacent. Civilian oversight, procurement offices, at least one congressional staff level, we believed. We were careful about who we told what. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. My team's last active operation was targeting a specific node in the network. A mid-sized contracting firm that we believed was the financial routing point for the broader structure. We had a source inside. Good source, careful, had been providing reliable information for 8 months. He stopped. Celeste waited. The source was burned, Wesley said. We don't know how. They were found in their apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, on a Tuesday morning in October. The official finding was suicide. He looked at the table. I didn't believe that then. I don't believe it now. The room was very quiet. The man who died, Celeste said. Was he the one you mentioned? The one in Arlington? No, the one in Arlington came later. Different operation, same network, same pattern. He looked up at her. After the second death, I started the process of leaving. Tessa was 5 and Lauren had been gone 4 months, and I made a decision. That the work wasn't worth it. That the work wasn't mine to carry anymore. There's a difference. She considered that distinction for a moment. He could see her working with it, taking it apart carefully the way she took apart financial documents. You think the network is still operational, she said, 8 years later. Things like that don't dismantle themselves. They adapt. The specific contracts change, the company names change, the personnel in key positions rotate. But the structure, the method, the relationships, the reach into oversight, that persists unless someone takes it apart deliberately from the outside. He nodded at her laptop. What you've built over 14 months, if it's connected the way I think it might be, you're not just exposing one COO and his shell companies. You're pulling a thread that's attached to something that's been running for at least a decade. Celeste looked at the encrypted drive in the interior pocket of her coat, which she'd laid over the back of her chair. I thought I was filing a fraud case, she said. You might still be. I might be wrong about the connection. But you don't think you're wrong? He was quiet for a beat. No, I don't. She looked at him steadily. Then what happens tomorrow? I walk into a meeting with a federal investigator. I hand over this drive. And I'm handing it to someone whose reach and reliability I can't verify, whose office may or may not be compromised the same way you've described in other oversight structures. That's a real problem, Wesley agreed. So what do I do? You don't hand over the only copy, he said, and you find out who the investigator reports to and who has access to the case assignment before you walk in that door. And if I can't verify that to my satisfaction, then you don't walk in that door. He paused. Stroud has contacts. Better contacts than he'll admit to, in my experience. Let him do the background work on the investigator's office. And in the meantime, the documents need to exist in more than one place. She nodded slowly, already thinking through logistics. Rourke can hold a copy. She's genuinely careful. She uses secure document management. She doesn't take risks with client material. Somewhere physical too, Wesley said. Digital copies can be located and destroyed if someone has enough access. Paper is harder to find and can't be remotely wiped. You're very specific about this. I've seen it go the wrong way. He said it without inflection. Once. She didn't press for the story behind that. He noticed her decision not to press, which was its own kind of consideration. Stroud came back in at 1:45 in the morning, carrying the particular expression of a man who has been in 4 phone conversations simultaneously and has processed a quantity of information that needs organizing before it can be delivered. He sat down. He accepted the coffee Wesley pushed toward him and drank half of it in one go. The 2 men taken at the diner are not talking, he said, which is not surprising and is actually somewhat informative because men who don't talk have usually been told specifically not to and have been given a reason to believe that not talking is safer than talking, which tells us something about who they report to. He set the cup down. Hale's passport shows he boarded a flight to Montreal at 9:47 this evening. That was approximately 4 hours after the blackout at the diner, which means he moved fast. He knew it had failed, Celeste said. He knew within the hour, which means he had communication with whoever was running the operation on the ground. Stroud looked at Wesley. The name you gave me, I made 3 calls. The third one told me what I needed to know. And? Wesley said. It's active, Stroud said. The network. Still operating, restructured twice in the last 8 years, but the core relationships are intact. My contact says there's an ongoing federal investigation, separate from what Celeste was feeding into, that's been building a case for 14 months. Celeste sat up. The same 14 months I've been building mine. Possibly, Stroud said. Possibly your COO's activities flagged something in that investigation without anyone knowing the other investigation existed. That kind of parallel track problem is more common than it should be. He looked at her directly. The investigator you're meeting tomorrow morning, I know him. His name is Farrow, David Farrow. He's been with Public Integrity for 11 years. I did some background calls in the last hour. He's clean. His office is clean. The case assignment is narrow enough that only 3 people in his division know the meeting is happening. Who are the 3 people? Stroud named them. Celeste wrote them down. The meeting stands? She asked. The meeting stands, Stroud said. But Wesley's point about the copy is right. Don't walk in there with the only version of anything. He paused. I'd also recommend you don't go alone. I'm not going to bring a security escort to a meeting with a federal investigator. It looks defensive. It is defensive, Stroud said mildly. You were targeted tonight. Being defensive is the correct posture. He looked at her over his coffee cup. I'll go with you. You're my security director. That's not subtle. I'm a retired naval commander with 30 years of federal contractor relationships. I can be there as a professional contact. It's not a stretch. He glanced at Wesley. You should tell Farrow what you told me. About the contractor, about the operations, about what happened 8 years ago. Wesley was quiet. Wesley, Celeste said. He looked at her. You said 3 days, she said. Stroud asked you for 3 days and you said yes. I know what I said. Then this is what 3 days looks like. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to go back to anything. I'm asking you to sit in a room and tell the truth about something you already know, which is not a military operation. It's a conversation. Wesley looked at his hands. Tessa gets home Sunday, he said. I know. She's going to want to tell me everything about the camp. Every meal and every project and every argument with whoever she shared a tent with. She's going to want my full attention for approximately 4 hours straight. That sounds exactly right, Celeste said. I'm not negotiating anything that interferes with that. I would not ask you to. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very good at this, he said. At what? Knowing when to push and when to just wait. Celeste allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one in several hours. I spent 20 years in boardrooms with people who thought I should be somewhere else. You learn to read the room. I imagine. Wesley. She said his name with a particular directness that had nothing performative in it. What happened to your team? The source you lost? The man in Arlington? None of that gets resolved by you going back to maintenance work on Friday morning and leaving the network running. I know that's not why you'd agree to talk to Farrow, but it's true anyway. He looked at the table. He thought about Falls Church, Virginia, on a Tuesday in October. He thought about the phone call he'd gotten 3 weeks after he'd submitted his separation paperwork. A call from a number he didn't recognize, a voice he did recognize, saying simply that Rodriguez had been found and that the official finding was being processed, and that he should hear it from someone who knew the truth of it before he heard the official version. He thought about standing in the hallway of the apartment he'd moved into after Lauren's funeral, Tessa asleep in the next room, and putting the phone down and pressing his back against the wall and staying there for a long time in the dark. He thought about the fact that he'd spent 8 years not doing anything with that. Not because he'd made peace with it. He hadn't. He'd just made a different calculation. That Tessa needed him more than Rodriguez needed justice, which was true, and that he couldn't pursue both simultaneously, which was also true, and that those 2 true things combined had given him sufficient reason to stop. He'd been telling himself for 8 years that it was a decision and not a surrender, and most of the time he'd believed it. He wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Okay, he said, just that. 1 word, and it was enough. Up. They slept in shifts. Stroud's 2 men maintained position outside the safe room. Wesley took the chair by the door from 1 until 4, then Stroud took over and Wesley slept on the second couch for 3 hours with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to extract maximum restoration from minimum available time. He woke up to the sound of Audrey's voice. She was awake and had found, in one of the kitchen cabinets, a box of instant oatmeal packets, and was in the process of making herself breakfast with the serious independence of a child who had decided that waiting for adults was optional when the task was straightforward enough. The microwave instructions say 2 minutes, she told Wesley when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. But I think that's a general estimate because every microwave has its own personality and you have to adjust. What microwave personality does this one have? Audrey considered. Optimistic but imprecise. I'm going to give it 1:45. She was right. The oatmeal came out correctly. Wesley made coffee and she sat at the small kitchen table and ate her oatmeal with the methodical satisfaction of someone completing a project. And Gerald was propped against the sugar container, and for several minutes neither of them said anything. Are we safe now? Audrey asked. Yes, Wesley said. And then, because she was 8 and not stupid, the situation is still complicated, but nobody is trying to get to us right now. We're safe here. Audrey nodded, absorbing this. Is my mom okay? She's asleep in the other room. She worked very late. She does that, Audrey said. She waits until she thinks I'm asleep, and then she works. She thinks I don't know. You know a lot of things for 8. 9 in March, Audrey corrected. And my dad said smart people don't get smarter by pretending things are simpler than they are. She looked at her oatmeal. He said that a lot. I think he was talking about his job, but I use it for everything. Smart application. I thought so. She scraped the last of the oatmeal from the cup. Are you going to help my mom fix the problem? Wesley looked at her. I'm going to try. You don't have to, she said. She has people for that. She always says she has people. A pause. I think she says it because it sounds like things are handled, but I think sometimes the people don't actually know what to do, and she has to figure it out herself. That's a complicated observation. It's just what I see. She set the cup down. You know what to do. You knew it last night in the dark. You didn't have to figure it out, you just knew. She looked at him with those direct, unnervingly perceptive eyes. My mom needs people who actually know what to do, not people who wait to see what she decides. Wesley said nothing for a moment. You're going to be a difficult person to work for when you grow up, he said. Audrey grinned. It was sudden and bright and entirely unguarded, the first time he'd seen her face do something completely unmanaged. And it was so much like the expression he occasionally caught on Tessa, the full, unrestrained version of delight that children sometimes unleash without warning, that it hit him somewhere behind the sternum. My mom says that too, Audrey said. Celeste woke at 6:15 with the immediate, complete alertness of someone whose brain had not actually turned all the way off even during sleep. She came into the kitchen looking like she'd had 3 hours of rest in her clothes, which was accurate, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw Wesley and Audrey at the table. Audrey was teaching Wesley to play a card game using a deck she'd found in the same cabinet as the oatmeal. A slightly incomplete deck, missing the 7 of clubs and 1 of the jacks, facts which Audrey had already incorporated into a modified rule set. You can't put a 6 on a 9 unless you have a red card in your hand, Audrey was explaining, because of the gap. What gap? Wesley said. The 7 of clubs gap. It creates an asymmetry in the sequence logic. You made that up. I adapted, Audrey said with tremendous dignity. Celeste stood in the doorway and watched her daughter explain the rules of a game she was inventing in real time to a former Navy SEAL who was listening with absolute seriousness, and something shifted in her chest in a way she had no immediate classification for. There's oatmeal, Audrey said, noticing her. I made some, and it worked. I see that. Celeste came in and poured coffee. She looked at Wesley. Did you sleep? Some. Enough? Enough. He set his cards down. Stroud's been up since 5. He wants to leave for the meeting by 8:30. He's got an update on Hale. Celeste wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Good update or bad? Hale didn't make it to Montreal. She looked at him sharply. He was stopped at the border, Wesley said. Customs flagged his passport against an existing watch list. Nothing to do with last night. This was an existing federal marker that Stroud's contact says has been on there for 4 months. He's in custody. He's been there since 11:30 last night. Celeste absorbed this. He's been sitting in a border holding facility. While his people failed their operation and he couldn't contact them, yes. The implication of this expanded quietly in the room for a moment. He's going to want to make a deal, she said. That's what Stroud's contact thinks. He hasn't talked yet. But he also hasn't lawyered up, which is its own signal. A man who intends to stay silent gets a lawyer immediately. A man who's calculating his options keeps his mouth shut but leaves the door open. And if he talks, then what you have on that drive becomes part of a much larger case, and the network I told you about gets its thread pulled from two directions simultaneously. Wesley looked at her. Which is how you dismantle something that survived 8 years of single-directional pressure. Celeste was quiet for a moment. She looked at her daughter, who had begun re-explaining the Seven of Clubs gap theory to Gerald, because Gerald had apparently been asking follow-up questions. My company, she said, quietly enough that Audrey wouldn't catch it. The employees, 340 people who didn't do anything wrong. If this becomes a large federal investigation, if Armitage Technologies gets pulled into the center of something that size, that's a real risk, Wesley said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. But the alternative is that the network keeps running, and the next person it targets might not have 14 months of documentation and a retired SEAL at the adjacent table. She looked at him. He'd said it without any particular emphasis, just as a fact among other facts, and she found that she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated reassurance. The drive, she said, making a decision. Rourke received a copy last night. I need to send one more copy to my attorney before we leave. And I want someone external, not connected to my company, not connected to Stroud's contacts, holding a physical version of the core documentation. Who? She thought for a moment. My sister. She lives in Philadelphia. She's a librarian. She is the least connected person I know to any of this, and she has a safety deposit box. And if I call her, she will not ask a single question because she has the disposition of a person who reads a lot of mystery novels and will simply accept that something interesting is happening and do what I ask. Wesley looked at her. Your sister, the librarian. With the safety deposit box? Yes. Okay, he said. Don't say it like that. Like what? Like you're trying not to find it funny. I'm not trying not to find it funny, he said. I do find it funny. It's also a good idea. She almost smiled. I'm going to call her before we leave. Tell her not to discuss it on a cell phone. She has a landline. She's the only person I know under 70 who still has a landline. I like her already, Wesley said. And the smile made it through that time, brief and genuine, the kind that happened when something was actually funny, and not just the version of funny that people performed for each other in professional contexts. They left the safe room at 8:20. The morning was clear and cold, the city in full October efficiency. Nobody on the street paying any attention to a woman in an expensive coat flanked by two men who didn't particularly look like security, and one small girl who was conducting a survey of the sidewalk's available food carts with focused interest. Stroud had arranged a vehicle, an ordinary town car, not the more conspicuous black security model, and they loaded into it with the practiced ease of people who had sorted out their logistics before coming downstairs. Audrey pressed her face against the window as they pulled into traffic. What are all those yellow flags on that building? Construction company marker, Wesley said, from the seat beside her. They all look the same. They're supposed to. Seems like a missed opportunity, Audrey said. If I had to put up a flag, I would put up a specific flag. What kind of flag? Audrey thought about it seriously. Probably teal, with a secondary pattern, maybe a geometric detail. That's a well-considered flag. I have opinions about flags, Audrey said, with complete seriousness. In the front seat, Stroud was on the phone. Celeste was reviewing notes on her phone, the reading glasses on again, and Wesley sat beside Audrey and looked out the window at the city going about its business, and thought about what came next. The meeting with Farrow would be the first step. Hale in custody was an unexpected development that changed the leverage picture significantly. A man calculating his options was a man who might, with the right combination of evidence and pressure, provide information that no amount of document forensics could extract. Then he looked at the back of Celeste's head, the dark hair, the precise way she held herself, even reading glasses in a car seat and 3 hours of sleep, the particular straight-backed quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten very good at not showing the weight of it. He thought about what Audrey had said in the safe room kitchen. She needs people who actually know what to do. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd planned a short stack and a cup of coffee, and a quiet evening in the only place that still felt like company without demanding anything from him. Instead, he was here. And the thing he had spent 8 years not finishing was, apparently, not finished. The town car turned onto a midtown cross street in the clean October light, and Wesley Kane, who had once been a lieutenant and was presently a maintenance worker and was uncertain about the territory in between, looked out the window at the ordinary morning and thought that Thursday evenings at Manny's were probably going to be complicated for a while. The building where David Farrow's office maintained its public integrity division came into view half a block ahead. Stroud ended his call. Celeste put her phone away and took off her reading glasses and became visibly the person she was in professional rooms, composed, prepared, the executive version of herself that took up its full space without apology. She turned and looked at Wesley. He nodded once. She nodded back. "Okay," Audrey said to Gerald. "I think it's going to be a long morning, but I have you and 3 more pretzel packets in my coat, so we're positioned well." When it was Wesley's turn, he laid out what he knew methodically: the operations, the source network, the contractor's role as financial router, the 2 deaths and the circumstances of each, the pattern of information compromise that had ended the investigation 8 years prior. He was precise about what he knew directly and what was inference, and he was clear about which elements were his to share and which had originally been classified, noting each time that he understood the classification limitations and was offering what he was legally able to offer, and that Farrow could pursue the rest through appropriate channels if he determined it was relevant. Farrow listened without interrupting. He asked 4 questions, each one specific, each one indicating he'd heard not just the information but its structure, what it pointed toward, what it left open, where the gaps were that needed filling. At the end, Farrow leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then at Wesley. "The source you lost," Farrow said, 8 years ago in Falls Church." "Yes." "We had a file on that. Official finding was accepted at the time." He paused. "We reopened it 6 months ago." Wesley was quiet. "I can't tell you where that reopening stands," Farrow said, "but I can tell you it's not closed." He held Wesley's gaze. "I want you to understand that." Wesley understood it. He nodded once and didn't say anything else about it, because there was nothing else to say right now, and because the thing he felt when Farrow said those words was not something he was going to perform in a federal office with Celeste across the table and Stroud watching from the corner. The federal marker on Hale's passport, it turned out, had been placed there by Farrow's office 4 months ago when their own investigation had reached his name. Hale didn't know that. He thought he'd been caught by coincidence, which gave Farrow's team a particular kind of leverage in the negotiation that was now underway with Hale's hastily acquired attorney. "The next 72 hours are going to move fast," Farrow told Celeste as they stood to leave. "Your company is going to face some scrutiny. I'm not going to tell you that's avoidable. But the documentation you've provided and the manner in which you've provided it positions Armitage Technologies as a cooperating victim rather than a participant. That distinction matters significantly in terms of what comes next for your people." Celeste accepted this with a brief nod that contained, Wesley thought, an enormous amount of controlled relief. 340 employees, she said. "I know," Farrow said. It wasn't dismissive. It was the voice of a man who had made this calculation before and knew what it cost. "We'll do what we can." They came out into the hallway and found Audrey presenting Pauline with a completed floor plan of the building, annotated with what appeared to be efficiency recommendations for the waiting area seating arrangement. "I moved the chairs in my drawing," Audrey explained. "The current layout creates a bottleneck near the elevator. If you shift the 2 chairs on the left by 45 degrees, you improve the traffic flow significantly." Pauline appeared to be genuinely considering this. "You know, I've always thought those chairs were awkward there." "They are," Audrey confirmed. "It's a fixable problem." Wesley looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at Wesley. Something passed between them that neither of them labeled. "Come on, architect," Celeste said, and took Audrey's hand. The week that followed was not orderly. Wesley had told Stroud 3 days, and 3 days became 5 when Farrow's team came back with additional questions that only Wesley could answer, and 5 became 8 when Hale began talking and the information he provided opened lateral branches of the investigation that required cross-referencing against the operational history Wesley had lived through. He went to work each morning and went to the federal building in the afternoons. and he picked Tessa up from the bus station on Sunday evening as planned, and Tessa talked for 3 hours straight about the camp, the circuits project, the tent arguments, a girl named Margot who had been initially insufferable and had by day 4 become her closest ally. And Wesley listened to all of it with his full attention because that was the deal he'd made with himself, and he kept the deals he made with himself. He told Tessa a simplified version of events. A friend needed help with a complicated work problem, and he'd been in a position to help, so he had. Tessa was 9 and considerably sharper than her age suggested, and she looked at him during this explanation with the particular evaluating expression she'd inherited from a mother she barely remembered, but had apparently absorbed in some deep cellular way. "What kind of friend?" Tessa said. "Someone I met recently." "How recently?" "This week." Tessa considered this. "So you made a friend this week?" "I helped someone." "That's not the same as making a friend." "You're right," Wesley said, "but it might be the start of the same thing." Tessa seemed to find this answer sufficient, or at least interesting enough to let sit for a while. She went back to her dinner. "Margot's dad works in construction," she offered, apparently as a related data point. "She says he knows how to fix anything. Useful skill. She wants us to come over sometime, to their house. I said I'd have to ask you." She looked at him with studied casualness that was not casual at all. "Do you ever want to go to people's houses? Like for dinner or whatever?" Wesley looked at his daughter. "Sometimes," he said. Tessa nodded, filed this, and moved on. But he caught the small satisfaction in her expression before she moved on. The look of someone who had asked a question carefully and gotten an answer that opened a door she'd been standing outside of for a while. 9 years old, paying more attention than he'd given her credit for. The federal case moved in the particular way federal cases moved, with enormous invisible momentum behind a surface of procedural deliberateness. Hale, facing the choice between his existing exposure and what Farrow's team laid out as the alternative, made the calculation that most people in his position made once they understood the full dimensions of what they were facing. He talked. He talked extensively, carefully, with the precision of a man who had spent years managing information and now applied those same skills to managing his own survival. The names he provided confirmed what Wesley had told Farrow. The Carver Group's network was larger than even Wesley's estimate, 17 active participants across 4 states, with reach into 2 federal procurement offices and 1 congressional appropriations staff member whose involvement had been suspected but never provable until Hale laid out the relationship in specific, documented terms. The congressional staff member resigned within 48 hours of being contacted by federal agents, citing personal reasons, and was arrested at his home in Maryland the following morning. The arrests happened over the course of 11 days, staggered in a way that prevented early-stage detainees from warning later-stage targets. Wesley read about most of it in brief updates from Stroud, who had become the informal communication relay, and the rest he pieced together from what Farrow confirmed in their follow-up sessions. His own role remained entirely off the public record, which was what he'd asked for and what Farrow had delivered. His name appeared in no filings, no press releases, no background briefings. As far as the public account of events was concerned, he did not exist in this story, which was exactly how he wanted it. Armitage Technologies survived. This was not automatic and it was not without cost. The company's stock dropped 17% in the first week after the investigation became public, and 3 board members resigned in what they called a response to the reputational uncertainty, and what was probably, Celeste said flatly to Wesley over the phone one evening, a response to the fact that they'd been friends with Hale and were managing their own discomfort. 2 major clients put contracts on review pending outcome of the investigation. The financial press ran 12 days of stories with varying degrees of accuracy about the company's exposure and future viability. Celeste managed all of it. Wesley watched from a deliberate distance, close enough to be available, far enough not to presume, and what he observed was a woman who had built something real and was fighting for it with the specific, undramatic tenacity of someone who understood that the people depending on her did not have the luxury of waiting for her to be overwhelmed. She called him most evenings during that period. Not always for long, sometimes just 10 or 15 minutes, reporting on the day's events, thinking out loud about decisions she needed to make, occasionally asking a direct question to which she wanted a direct answer. He gave what he had. She thanked him without making too much of it. On the 9th evening, she called later than usual, after 10. And when he answered, she didn't say anything for a moment. "Long day," he said. "Rourke told me today that she's been worried about me," Celeste said. "Rourke never tells me she's worried about me. She tells me operational risks. She tells me probability assessments. She told me today that she was worried about me specifically, as a person, which took approximately 4 minutes of obvious difficulty to get out." "What did you say?" "I told her I was fine." "Are you?" A pause. "I told a federal investigator this morning that I believed in what my company stood for and that I intended to rebuild it around a stronger ethical foundation, and I meant every word of that. And then I came back to my office and sat at my desk for 20 minutes and couldn't pick up the next thing on my list because I was so tired that my hands felt heavy." A longer pause. "I don't usually tell people that." "I know," he said. "You make it easy not to manage things," she said. "I'm not sure that's a compliment or a complaint." "Probably both," he said. She laughed. It was short and slightly surprised, the laugh of someone who hadn't planned on laughing, and he found he liked the sound of it considerably. "How's Tessa?" she asked. "She has a project due Monday. It's a model of the solar system, and she's decided that the store-bought foam balls are the wrong texture, and she needs to make her own from papier-mâché. Is that going well?" "My kitchen currently looks like a papier-mâché incident," Wesley said. "Saturn has 3 rings at the moment instead of the canonical number because we ran out of the right material and she improvised." "How many rings does Saturn actually have?" "Technically hundreds of distinct ringlets, but the standard model uses 3 major groups. Tessa has decided her version has aesthetic merit." "She's not wrong," Celeste said. "Artistic license applied to astronomy. That's defensible." "That's what I told her. She's going to be interesting when she's older." "She's interesting now," Wesley said. "She's also covered in papier-mâché paste, and I need to make sure she showers before she calcifies." Celeste laughed again, longer this time, and he let the sound of it sit in the room for a moment. "Celeste," he said. "Yes." "You're going to be okay. The company is going to be okay. Rourke is right to be worried about you specifically, but she'd be more worried if you weren't tired. The tired means you're carrying the right things." A silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say, but of someone receiving something and deciding what to do with it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. Not just the Pharaoh meetings, all of it." "Audrey started it," he said. "She did," Celeste agreed. "She's going to hear about that for the rest of her life." They said goodnight, and he put the phone down and went back to the kitchen, where Tessa was applying a 3rd coat of paste to a lopsided sphere that was going to be Jupiter, and explaining to it, in the manner of someone coaching a reluctant athlete, that it needed to maintain its structural integrity. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The apartment was warm and smelled like flour paste and the particular comfortable disorder of a project in progress. And Tessa was narrating at Jupiter with total focus, and the papier-mâché situation was genuinely significant, and he thought about what Celeste had said. The tired means you're carrying the right things, and thought that was true in both directions. He was tired in a way he hadn't been in years. Not the numb, going through motions tired of the first years after Lauren, but the tired that comes from actually doing something that matters, from spending real energy on real things. It felt different. He noticed the difference. "Dad," Tessa said without looking up, "Jupiter needs to dry overnight. Can I leave it on the counter?" "Yes, but move it away from the edge." I know. She scooted it carefully to the center of the counter. "It's fragile. I know." 3 weeks after the diner, Celeste called on a Saturday morning and asked if Tessa liked science museums. Wesley considered this. "Is that a general inquiry or a specific one?" "Audrey has been asking about Tessa every day since the safe room," Celeste said. "She knows that Tessa was at science camp, and she's decided, based on this information, that they would be compatible. She has been managing her interest with restraint for 3 weeks, which for Audrey is a significant exercise in patience, and I think we're near the limit of it." "What does she want to do?" "She wants to go to the Natural History Museum. She says it's mutually beneficial because they have a space exhibit that Tessa would probably like, and also a whole floor about ecosystems, and also a cafe that she has researched and determined serves an acceptable hot chocolate." She researched the hot chocolate. "She took this seriously," Celeste said, with the tone of someone reporting accurately and without editorializing. Wesley thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. What time? He could hear in the background Audrey's voice, not the words, just the pitch and register, the sound of someone who had received good news and was processing it with characteristic intensity. The museum was crowded on a Saturday, which neither of the adults had fully anticipated, and both of them probably should have. They navigated it with the particular coordination of two people who were good at logistics, and had children with strong opinions about direction, which meant that the actual route through the exhibits bore limited resemblance to any planned sequence and considerable resemblance to whatever Tessa and Audrey agreed was the correct priority. The girls had found their footing within about 8 minutes. Wesley had watched this happen with the same slightly disoriented attention he brought to most things involving Audrey. The speed of her social assessment, the directness of her approach, the way she'd simply presented herself to Tessa as a person with views and interests and waited to see if the views and interests found purchase. Tessa, who was not shy but was selective, had looked at Audrey for a long moment, determined something satisfactory, and asked what she thought about the asteroid extinction event. Audrey had an opinion, a detailed one, with follow-up questions. That was essentially that. They were now 15 feet ahead of the adults, deep in an argument about whether the asteroid's angle of impact had been the decisive factor, or whether the scale of the resulting climate shift would have been fatal, regardless. "How long do you think this has been building up?" Celeste asked, watching them. "Which part?" "The asteroid debate, specifically." "Since they met," Wesley said. "Audrey's been running that question in the background. She just needed someone who'd take it seriously." "Tessa takes everything seriously." "She does," he agreed. "It's a quality I've tried to encourage and occasionally regretted." They walked. The museum moved around them, dinosaur skeletons and habitat dioramas, and the particular hushed awe of large exhibition spaces, children and families and school groups navigating the same rooms in different directions. Celeste was different outside the operational mode he'd seen her in for the past weeks, not less herself. She was recognizably the same person, the same directness, the same controlled attention, but with more of the edges visible, the things she managed in professional contexts that she didn't manage here. She looked at the exhibits with genuine interest. She disagreed with a placard's summary of a geological period and said so to Wesley in a tone that made clear she'd read about this before and had an actual position. She bought a coffee from a cart and drank it while walking without worrying about whether it looked appropriate. He found he liked this version of her considerably. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The night in the diner, before the lights went out, when you noticed the man at the counter," she paused. "You'd been watching the room from the moment we sat down, hadn't you? Not just from when I mentioned security." "Yes," he said. "You were watching it before we sat down." "I watch every room I'm in. I told you, it's a habit." "I know. I'm not asking whether you did it. I'm asking—" She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, which was unusual for her. "Were you watching us specifically, before Audrey came over?" He thought about the honest answer, which he gave. "I noticed you when you came in. You moved differently from most people in the room, and Audrey—" He stopped briefly. "Audrey was watching everything, the same way I watch everything, not suspiciously, just taking full inventory." He glanced at her. "I recognize it. I see it in Tessa sometimes. A kid who's learned to pay attention to rooms because rooms can change without warning." Celeste was quiet for a moment. The grief counselor said something similar, that Audrey had developed a hypervigilance that was protective in origin. She phrased it more clinically than that. "The clinical version and the real version are the same thing," Wesley said. "She's careful because she's learned that the people she loves can disappear. So she pays attention in case she can catch it this time." He said it simply, without dressing it, and he knew as he said it that he was also describing himself, and that Celeste knew that. She walked beside him for a moment. "Did it help? Paying attention?" "No," he said. "Lauren was just gone. No warning, nothing to have caught. A blood clot, 4 years after I'd survived things I had no reasonable right to survive." He looked at his hands briefly. "The paying attention doesn't protect you from the random things. It just keeps you occupied while you're waiting to find out whether this situation is random or not." "And Thursday evenings at Manny's." "And Thursday evenings at Manny's," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been doing something similar, just different room. I put Audrey in the best school, the best therapist, the best everything, and I work very long hours and I'm very good at my job and I haven't let anyone. She stopped and tried again. It's been 2 years and I've had approximately 3 personal conversations that weren't with my attorney or my CFO or my daughter's school. Until now, Wesley said. She looked at him sideways. Until now. They walked in silence for a bit, the kind of silence that wasn't empty. Ahead, the girls had reached the space exhibit, and Tessa had found the scale model of the solar system suspended from the ceiling and was already locating Saturn. And Wesley could see the precise moment she identified the rings and turned to tell Audrey something, and Audrey looked up and her face did the thing, the unguarded, full-brightness version of delight. And Tessa laughed at whatever Audrey said in response. Wesley watched them. He felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for exactly. Not happiness, quite, because happiness was too simple a word for something that had this much weight in it. The specific weight of 2 years of Thursday evenings and empty chairs and the careful, constructed solitude of a life arranged around a loss. More like the feeling of a door that had been stuck for a long time and had finally shifted, not open yet, but shifted. The resistance in the mechanism changed. "She's good," Celeste said softly. She was watching the girls too. "Tessa, she's really good with her." "Audrey makes it easy," Wesley said. "She does," Celeste agreed. "She's always done that. Walked straight up to the thing she wants and asked for it. Her father was the same way." A pause. "I've always been the one who plans and assesses and builds the case before I move. And then I married someone who just walked straight at things, and it—" She stopped. "It worked. As a combination." Wesley thought about that. He thought about Lauren, who had been patient in a way he was not, and steady in a way that complemented his particular brand of alert vigilance. She'd called it his watching everything face, affectionately, with the specific ease of someone who had decided a person's strange habits were part of the package and the package was worth it. Opposites wasn't quite right. Compliments was closer. "Your sister with the safety deposit box," he said. "Did she ask questions eventually?" Celeste smiled. "She called me 4 days later and said, and I'm quoting exactly, 'I don't know what's in that envelope and I've decided I don't want to know, but you owe me the full story at Christmas and it better be good.'" "Is it good enough?" "She's going to be insufferably pleased about it," Celeste said. "She reads a lot of mystery novels. This is the best thing that's ever happened to her vicariously." Wesley almost laughed. The exhibit hall was bright and large and full of the particular noise of interested children, and ahead of them Tessa was explaining something to Audrey with her hands, a habit she had when she was excited about a concept, the ideas becoming physical. And Audrey was listening with her head tilted slightly and Gerald tucked under one arm. "She brought the rabbit to a museum," Wesley said. "Gerald goes everywhere," Celeste said. "I stopped having opinions about it." "That seems right." "It was either that or have the argument every morning. Gerald travels. It's simply a fact now." They reached the space exhibit and Tessa immediately began directing Audrey's attention to specific planets with the authority of someone who had done significant personal research, which she had, given the papier-mâché situation of the past week. "That one's wrong," Tessa said, pointing at the model Saturn. "The ring proportions are off. Also, the color's too uniform. The actual rings have different densities in different sections, so they'd look different from this angle." Audrey looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I've been making the solar system out of papier-mâché for a school project," Tessa said. "You have to know exactly what you're making." Audrey considered this for one beat. "Can I help with it?" Tessa looked at her. "Do you have opinions about papier-mâché?" "I have opinions about everything," Audrey said. "Okay," Tessa said. "Yeah, you can help." Wesley looked at Celeste. She was watching their daughters with an expression that was mostly composed and slightly not, the particular not quite composed look of a person who had arranged their face to reflect equanimity and found the arrangement briefly insufficient for what was actually happening. He understood that. He was having a similar experience. "Hot chocolate," he said. "The one Audrey researched." Celeste pulled herself together with a small, deliberate breath that he noticed, and she probably thought he hadn't. "She said the cafe is on the 3rd floor. She researched the floor too?" "She had notes," Celeste said. They walked toward the stairs, and the girls fell in beside them without being called. Tessa mid-sentence about ring density, and Audrey asking follow-up questions that suggested she was going to have opinions about papier-mâché ring structure before the afternoon was out. The museum moved around them. Its vast, comfortable noise, the specific light of exhibition halls, the accumulated human interest of people looking at things that mattered. And Wesley Kane, who had spent 8 years learning how to be very still and very solitary, walked through it with 3 other people and found that the stillness, for once, was not what the moment required. The cafe on the 3rd floor did, in fact, serve acceptable hot chocolate. Audrey had been accurate about this, as she was accurate about most things she chose to have opinions about. They stayed until the museum closed. It was the kind of afternoon that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening. The girls argued about Saturn's rings and ate hot chocolate, and Tessa got whipped cream on her jacket and Audrey helped her address it with paper napkins, and the kind of practical solidarity that doesn't require existing friendship to deploy. Celeste told Wesley about the company's restructuring plan, not with the controlled precision of crisis management, but with the looser, more honest voice of someone describing something they actually cared about. The vision behind the plan, the people she was trying to protect in building it. Wesley talked about the maintenance work, not apologetically, not as a placeholder for something better, as the thing it actually was, the specific satisfaction of a broken system made functional again, the clarity of problems that had definite solutions. She listened to this with the same direct attention she brought to everything, and she didn't treat it as an interesting thing to hear about a former Navy SEAL. She treated it as a person telling her what their work was like. That distinction mattered. Tessa, on the walk out through the museum's main hall, positioned herself beside Audrey and said, with the directness that was apparently a trait she shared with Wesley, "We should do this again." Audrey looked at her. "The museum specifically, or just something?" "Something," Tessa said. "You have good opinions." "I know," Audrey said. "That's not a modest thing to say." "My dad says false modesty is a waste of time," Audrey said. "I have good opinions. It's just true." Tessa considered this. Then, "My dad says almost nothing." "I know," Audrey said. "But when he does, it's worth listening." They came out into the early evening, the October air sharp and clean, the city going about its early dark routine of lights coming on and traffic shifting into the weekend register. The girls were ahead, still talking, and Wesley and Celeste walked a half step behind in the particular configuration of 2 people who had found a comfortable distance without having negotiated it. "Thank you," Celeste said. "For the museum?" "For Saturday," she said. "In general, for being the kind of person who shows up." He didn't say it was nothing, because it wasn't, and she would know that he knew it wasn't. He didn't make it larger than it was, because they were both people who had learned to be wary of things made larger than they were. "Tessa's going to want to show Audrey the papier-mâché solar system," he said. "Fair warning, it's currently on my kitchen counter, and Saturn has questionable ring integrity." "Audrey is going to have opinions about the ring integrity," Celeste said. "I assumed." "She's going to want to fix it. Tessa will resist initially and then accept the input." "That's very specific." "I've been watching Audrey for 3 weeks," he said. "She's predictable in the best way. She knows what she thinks, and she says it, and then she's completely open to new information." Celeste looked at him. "She got that from Daniel. He was exactly the same." They walked. "Come on," Tessa called back from half a block ahead. "The subway's this way." Audrey beside her turned and added with considerable authority, "We've verified it on the map. This direction." The adults exchanged a look. "Verified on the map," Celeste murmured. "She's thorough," Wesley said. They caught up with the girls and descended into the station together, into the specific underground noise of the city's evening. And the train came and they got on and the doors closed, and Tessa was explaining ring densities again, and Audrey was asking questions, and Gerald was propped against the subway pole with the patient dignity of an experienced traveler, and Wesley stood holding the overhead bar and watched his daughter's face, the lit-up version of it, the version that appeared when she was genuinely engaged and genuinely happy, and felt the door that had been stuck shift a little further. Not open. Not yet. But the resistance was different now. He thought that was probably enough for one Saturday. The papier-mâché solar system was finished on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the museum, and it was finished with Audrey's involvement, which meant Saturn now had a ring system that was both scientifically defensible and, according to Audrey, aesthetically superior to the museum's version. Tessa had resisted the input for approximately 20 minutes, as Wesley had predicted, and then had accepted it completely and incorporated Audrey's suggestions with the wholehearted commitment of someone who had decided a new idea was correct, and was now treating it as if she'd thought of it herself. This was a quality Wesley recognized in himself, and it made him quietly proud in the specific way that recognizing your own better habits in your child produces. Celeste had sat at Wesley's kitchen table while the girls worked and drunk tea from a mug that said something about a 5K run from 4 years ago that Wesley had never actually done. It had been Lauren's, a race Lauren had run the spring before she died. And she'd looked at the mug for a moment when she picked it up, but hadn't said anything about it, which was the right thing to do, and which he noticed. They'd been spending time together with a consistency that had moved past the formality of arrangements. It was less scheduled now. Celeste would call on a Tuesday and say she was in his neighborhood and did he want to get coffee, and he would say yes, and they would get coffee and talk for an hour, and it would feel like what it was, which was two people who had found that the other person's company was something they had developed a preference for. Tessa had started asking about Audrey the way she asked about her school friends, as a standing piece of her social world, someone whose presence didn't require explanation. Audrey had started leaving Gerald at home when she came over. Wesley had noticed this without commenting on it, and he thought it meant something, though he wasn't certain enough of his ability to read 8-year-olds to say what. The federal case resolved itself in the way large cases resolve, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of procedural developments that accumulated over months into something conclusive. Victor Hale pled guilty in December to 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction, and received a sentence that his attorney called disappointing and that Farrow's office called appropriate. The congressional staffer was convicted in a separate proceeding and sentenced in January. 4 additional members of the Carver Group's network were indicted across 3 states. 2 pled guilty and 2 were scheduled for trial. The contractor at the center of it, the organization Wesley had spent years trying to reach the core of, was formally dissolved by court order in February, its assets seized and its principals facing a combined 47 years of federal exposure. Farrow called Wesley the morning after the dissolution order was signed, briefly, to tell him. "Rodriguez's case," Farrow said. "The reopening I mentioned. The finding is going to be changed, officially. It's going to take a few more months to complete the process, but I wanted you to know it's moving." Wesley was in his truck, parked outside a distribution warehouse, where he was scheduled to begin an HVAC assessment at 8. It was February and cold, the windows fogged at the edges, the city moving in its gray winter way around the parking lot. "Thank you," he said. "It should have been done years ago," Farrow said. "I know." "For what it's worth something," Wesley said. "It's not everything, but it's something. Thank you." He sat in the truck for 5 minutes after the call ended. He didn't examine what he felt too closely because it was complicated, and he was parked in a warehouse lot, and the HVAC system was not going to assess itself. But he let the 5 minutes be what they were, which was a long time to sit with a thing that had needed sitting with for 8 years. Then he got out and went to work. In March, Armitage Technologies released its restructured ethics framework and announced a foundation, the Armitage Harmon Foundation, named for Celeste's married name and Daniel's mother's maiden name, a choice that Audrey had apparently advocated for with considerable force, supporting families of fallen service members and single-parent households in financial crisis. The announcement got moderate press attention, less than the scandal had generated, which was how these things usually worked, but the internal response from Armitage's employees was different. Celeste forwarded Wesley a note from a senior engineer, a man who'd been with the company 11 years, that said simply that he'd been planning to start looking for another position after everything that had come out, and that the foundation announcement had made him decide to stay. 340 people, Wesley remembered her saying. Most of them stayed. The company's stock recovered slowly, which was realistic, and the 2 major clients who'd put contracts on review both returned, one of them with an expanded engagement that Rourke described in a voice that suggested she was being professionally restrained about how pleased she was. The board reconstituted itself with 3 new members, all of them vetted by a process that Celeste had designed personally, and that was thorough to a degree that made the previous process look like a courtesy interview. Celeste told Wesley about all of this in the ordinary way she now told him things. Across his kitchen table, or on the phone after the girls were in bed, or walking through a neighborhood on a Saturday when neither of them had a specific destination. She'd stopped managing the information before she gave it to him. She'd stopped doing the thing where she summarized the version of events that made her look most in control and started just telling him what actually happened, including the parts where she'd made a wrong call or changed her mind, or sat at her desk with heavy hands and couldn't pick up the next thing. He didn't make those moments into anything. He just received them, and she'd learned that she could give them without them being used as evidence of something. That, he thought, was what happened when you spent enough time with a person in actual conditions rather than managed ones. You stopped presenting and started just being, and the other person either accepted what they found or they didn't. And with Celeste, somewhere between October and March, it had become clear that she accepted what she found. All of it. The empty chair implication of Thursday evenings, and the taciturnity and the faded work jacket and the specific closedness he carried like a second skin. She didn't try to fix it. She just sat across from it and drank her tea. Tessa's birthday was in April. She was turning 10, a number she had opinions about. Double digits, she said, implied a new organizational category for how you thought about yourself. And she was working on determining what that category was. Wesley asked what she wanted to do. Tessa said she wanted to go to a baseball game, which was unexpected, and also she wanted Audrey to come, which was not unexpected at all. "Can Audrey's mom come?" Tessa asked, with the same studied casualness she'd deployed around the topic of people's houses in October. "She probably likes baseball. She seems like she'd like baseball." "Why does she seem like that?" "She's the kind of person who pays attention to the whole game," Tessa said. "Not just the exciting parts. She'd watch the strategy." Wesley looked at his daughter. "You've thought about this," he said. "I think about things," Tessa said, in the tone of someone pointing out that water was wet. He called Celeste that evening. She picked up after 2 rings, which was faster than she usually answered, and he wondered later if she'd been expecting the call. "Tessa wants you at her birthday baseball game," he said. A brief pause. "Tessa wants me specifically?" "She has a theory about your relationship to baseball strategy." "That's a very specific thing to have a theory about." "She's a very specific person." Another pause, shorter. "I'd like that," Celeste said. "We'd both like that. What team?" "Yankees," Wesley said. "She has ancestral loyalty through Lauren's father, who was very serious about it. I've been informed that this is non-negotiable." "Noted," Celeste said, and he could hear the smile in it, and he found that he didn't try to do anything to not find that pleasing, which itself was a kind of change he'd been noticing in himself for months. The game was loud and cold and perfect in the specific way that April baseball is, which is to say, imperfect in all the right ways. The wind off the water, the inconsistent warmth of the spring sun, the unpredictable combination of a day that couldn't make up its mind about the season. Tessa wore her grandmother's old Yankees cap, which was too big for her, and sat at a slight tilt she refused to correct on the grounds that it had always sat that way. Audrey wore a hat she'd bought from a vendor outside the stadium, bright blue, bearing the Yankees logo, which she'd acquired with the decisiveness of someone who had determined that showing up unprepared to a sporting event was not an option. They sat in the lower tier, not the expensive seats and not the worst seats, somewhere in the middle where you could see the field properly and still hear the actual sounds of the game under the crowd noise. Celeste had brought a scorecard, which she filled out in neat, quick notations, and Tessa had watched this for 2 innings and then asked to be taught, and they spent the 3rd inning with their heads bent together over the card, while Wesley and Audrey ate hot dogs and watched the left fielder track a long fly ball. "Your mom knows baseball," Wesley told Audrey. "She knows everything," Audrey said with the comfortable certainty of someone who had not yet found the limit of this and was not particularly looking for it. "Nobody knows everything." "She comes close," Audrey said. "The things she doesn't know she figures out. It's basically the same." She said it without looking at him, watching the field, hot dog in one hand and new Yankees hat slightly askew, and she sounded like she was just describing a fact of the world, the same way she'd described the number of rings on Saturn, or the structural inefficiency of chair placement in a federal waiting room. Wesley looked at the field. He thought about what it meant that an 8-year-old, 9 since March, had walked up to a stranger's table in October and everything had proceeded from that single, ordinary act of trust. He thought about how close the alternative had been, how easily he might have been at a different table or already gone when they arrived, or sitting in the correct corner with the correct empty space and the correct orderly solitude of a man who had made a full accounting of what his life contained and accepted the total. He thought about the specific smallness of the thing that had changed everything. Not a crisis, not a revelation, not a dramatic intervention of any kind. A child with a stuffed rabbit who'd decided a stranger looked like someone worth sitting next to. You couldn't plan for that. You couldn't build toward it. It either happened or it didn't. And if you were spending all your available energy maintaining the walls of a life arranged around an absence, you might be positioned exactly wrong to let it in when it arrived. He'd been lucky. He knew he'd been lucky. And he didn't entirely trust luck, having lived long enough to know it moved without regard for what you deserved. But he thought that maybe luck required a certain availability, a not quite closed door, a Thursday evening at Manny's instead of alone in the apartment, a corner table that happened to be the only one with empty seats. He'd kept going out. That was the thing. Even in the worst of the first years, even when the going out felt like moving through resistance because everything did, he'd kept Tessa in school and himself in the world. And Thursday evenings he'd ended up at Manny's because sitting in the apartment alone felt like something he owed it to Lauren not to do. She'd loved diners. He went to diners. It wasn't much, but it was a door left open, even slightly. A door left open was how everything had gotten in. "Wesley," Audrey said. He looked at her. "You're doing the thinking face," she said. "What thinking face?" "The one where you look at the middle distance instead of the actual thing in front of you," she said. "Tessa told me you do it. Tessa has a lot of opinions about my expressions." "She's very observant," Audrey said, as if this settled the matter. On the field, the Yankees' third baseman made a diving stop that drew the crowd up in collective noise, and Tessa came straight off her seat with the instinctive physical response of someone who had inherited genuine love of the game, and Celeste followed a half-second behind, scorecard clutched in one hand, laughing at Tessa's reaction with the full, unmanaged version of her laugh that he'd heard maybe a dozen times, and that was always slightly surprising in how much it changed her face. Wesley stood too, and cheered, and it was loud and cold in April, and it was Tessa's birthday, and it was enough. 6 months after the diner, Wesley told Celeste something he hadn't told anyone in 4 years. They were walking in Riverside Park on a Sunday evening, the girls 20 feet ahead in the ongoing process of a conversation that had been running for 3 months across multiple locations and subjects, and the Hudson was doing its gray-silver thing in the early dark, and he told her about the last operation. Not the sanitized version he'd given Farrow, not the version he'd given Stroud, but the real one. What it had felt like to understand that the source was gone. What it had felt like to know the official finding was wrong. What it had felt like to stand in a hallway in an apartment that wasn't home yet and understand that he was going to file his separation papers and walk away and spend the rest of his life knowing he'd left it unfinished. He told her about the weight of that. The specific daily weight of something unresolved that you carried so long. It started to feel structural, load-bearing, like if you removed it, something else would collapse. Celeste walked beside him and listened the way she listened, completely, without building her response while he was still talking, without trying to reframe or resolve it before he was done. When he finished, she didn't say that it was okay or that he'd made the right decision or any of the things people said to fill the space. She said, "How does it feel now that it's finished?" He thought about it honestly. "Different," he said. "It doesn't feel resolved exactly. Rodriguez is still dead. The years it ran are still years it ran, but—" He paused. "There's a difference between a wound that's still bleeding and a wound that's scarred over. It still marks you. It's just not costing you the same way." She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," she said. "I've been very efficient about Daniel. I grieved appropriately. And I got Audrey into therapy and I restructured the company to accommodate the new situation, and I did everything correctly." She looked at the river. "And then I sat in a corner booth in a diner in October while my daughter talked to a stranger, and something about watching her just decide to trust someone, just walk straight up and ask. I couldn't decide if it was painful or the most hopeful thing I'd seen in 2 years." "Both," Wesley said. "Both," she agreed. "It was both." They walked for a while without talking, the river beside them in the dark, the girls' voices carrying back in fragments. Something about ecosystems, something about a movie they'd both apparently seen and had conflicting views about. "I'm not finished missing him," Celeste said. Daniel, I want to be clear about that. I know, Wesley said. I'm not finished missing Lauren. And this, she gestured between them, not dramatically, just indicating the fact of the thing that had been developing for 6 months and that neither of them had named yet with any precision. This isn't instead of. No, he agreed. It's not instead of anything. She looked at him. What is it then? He thought about what Audrey had said at the museum, about the man who said almost nothing but was worth listening to when he did. And he thought about Tessa's face at the baseball game. And he thought about the specific sensation he'd identified months ago as a door that had been stuck and was shifting. I think it's additional, he said. Not replacing, just more. Room for more. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the river. That's a very careful way to say something, she said. I'm a careful person. I know. A pause. It's accurate, though. I'll take accurate. He reached out and took her hand. He didn't make anything of it. She didn't either. They just walked, hands linked, in the particular easy way of two people who had arrived at something without having quite agreed to arrive, and the river moved beside them in the October dark, which was the same October dark it had been a year ago, and entirely different in everything that mattered. They married the following June, on a Saturday afternoon in a small ceremony that contained exactly the people it needed to contain and no one else. Stroud was there, looking uncomfortable in a suit but willing, and Rourke was there with the expression of someone who had seen this coming 18 months before anyone else and had the good professional sense not to say so until it was confirmed. Celeste's sister flew up from Philadelphia and shook Wesley's hand with the particular warmth of someone who had spent a year hearing a great deal about him and had drawn her own conclusions, and then told him, directly, that the story Celeste had told her at Christmas had been the best thing she'd heard in a decade, and she was sincerely grateful to whatever sequence of events had produced it. A diner and a stuffed rabbit, Wesley said. Celeste's sister pointed at him. That's the part I keep telling people. Tessa and Audrey stood beside them at the ceremony. Tessa had worn a dress she'd selected herself in blue, with the characteristic decisiveness she applied to things that mattered to her, and Audrey was in yellow because yellow was correct, and she had been very clear about this in the weeks preceding the event. Gerald was not present, having been left at home on the grounds, articulated by Audrey herself, that this was a day for people. Nobody cried, or rather nobody admitted to crying, which was a distinction the adults in the room were all maintaining with varying degrees of success. Afterward, the four of them, family now, in the unambiguous way that legal and emotional facts combined make something unambiguous, went back to Manny's. It had not been planned as a symbolic gesture. It had been planned because Tessa had requested the short stack, and Audrey had wanted to properly assess a chocolate milkshake in the location that had started everything, and those were sufficient reasons. Darlene was working the evening shift. She took one look at Wesley, and then at the three people with him, and at his suit, which he'd already loosened the tie on because some things were non-negotiable, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You want the corner table?" "Please," Wesley said. She sat them there, and it was the same corner, the same flickering light that had apparently still not been fixed, the same cracked vinyl that the management kept meaning to address. The same table at which Wesley Kane had sat alone with a cup of coffee and a short stack, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from a man who has learned to be very good at occupying small spaces without demanding anything of them. Tessa and Audrey immediately began arguing about the milkshake, which flavor was objectively superior, and whether the whipped cream was structural or decorative, and what the difference was between a milkshake and a frappe, because Audrey had read something about this distinction and had opinions. Celeste sat across from Wesley in the seat that had been empty. He looked at her and at the girls and at the table with its laminated menu and its small collection of sugar packets and the faint ring from 1,000 coffee cups before his, and he thought about the accounting he'd done in this corner for 4 years, the careful, honest reckoning of what the life contained and what the empty spaces meant and what a man owed to a loss he'd decided to carry indefinitely. He thought it was possible that he'd had the accounting wrong, not the loss. The loss was real and permanent, and he would carry Lauren the same way he'd carry the scar on his jaw, as a fact of the body that didn't require management or interpretation, just acknowledgement. But the empty space, he'd spent years understanding the empty chair as a preservation, as the correct and honest form of honoring what had been in it, as if filling it meant forgetting, as if moving meant leaving. What he understood now, sitting at the same corner table with a different life arranged around him, was that the space hadn't needed to be preserved. It had needed to be inhabited differently. Not replaced. That word was wrong for this, was always wrong for this. But built around. The way you built a house around a load-bearing wall. The wall was still there. The wall was still holding something. But rooms could be added. Wings could be built. The structure could expand to contain more than the original blueprint allowed for. He hadn't replaced Lauren with Celeste. He hadn't replaced the 4 years of Thursday evenings with whatever came next. He'd added. And the adding had not, as he'd feared in some quiet, unexamined part of himself, diminished anything. It had just changed the dimensions. He thought about Rodriguez, who was getting the official record corrected too late for it to matter to him, but not too late for it to matter to the people who had known him and had lived alongside the wrong story for 8 years. He thought about the work he'd done in November, the 3 days that became 8, and about the specific feeling of finishing something, and how finishing something that had been unfinished for years didn't feel triumphant the way you'd expect. It felt more like the removal of a low-grade sound you'd stopped hearing because it had been present so long, and the silence in its absence was startling and necessary, and eventually, clean. He thought about Tessa at 10, growing up with a friend who had opinions about everything and brought those opinions to every room she entered. He thought about what that would do to Tessa, who already paid attention to everything, to have someone in her life who turned that attention outward instead of inward, who metabolized the world through engagement rather than vigilance. He thought that was good for her. He thought he couldn't have designed it better if he'd tried, which he hadn't, which was maybe the point. Some of the best structures were the ones you didn't plan. You just kept showing up, kept the door open even slightly, kept going to Manny's on Thursday evenings because Lauren had loved diners, and it was a way of carrying her that didn't require staying still. "Dad," Tessa said, "Audrey says chocolate is objectively better, and I said it's a matter of preference, and she said that in matters of flavor preference, data exists and should be consulted." "She's not wrong that data exists," Wesley said. Tessa pointed at him. "That's not a position. That's a dodge." "I prefer vanilla," Wesley said. Both girls looked at him with the combined expression of people confronting an error of judgment. "That's incorrect," Audrey said, with tremendous patience. "It's a preference," Wesley said. "It's an uninformed preference," Audrey said, "which is different." Celeste reached across the table and put her hand over Wesley's and said nothing, which was its own form of position-taking on the great milkshake debate. Darlene came back with a coffee for Wesley and a tea for Celeste, and 2 chocolate milkshakes for the girls and a vanilla one for Wesley that she'd brought without being asked, which suggested she'd been paying more attention to corner table preferences for 4 years than he'd given her credit for. "Congratulations," Darlene said, looking at the assembled table with an expression that suggested she'd seen the suit and drawn accurate conclusions. "Thank you," Celeste said. Darlene moved on. The diner was busy, the way it was busy on weekend evenings. The particular cheerful noise of a place where people came to be warm and fed and briefly relieved of the effort of cooking, and the girls were deep in the milkshake assessment, and Celeste had her hands around her tea and was watching Audrey with the specific expression she wore when Audrey was being most herself, fond and slightly exhausted and proud in a way that didn't require performance. Across the room, a family came in. A young woman, maybe 30, with a boy of 5 or 6 who was half asleep on her shoulder, her jacket damp from the outside air, the expression of someone who'd had a day that had been too long in the wrong ways. The hostess was occupied, the tables nearly full, and the woman stood near the entrance looking at the room with the particular closed-face quality of someone who was too tired to show that they were tired. Audrey saw her. Wesley watched his stepdaughter. His stepdaughter, which was a word he was still calibrating his relationship to, clock the woman and the boy with the same inventory he applied to rooms, and then look at the table, at the available chairs, at the calculation of space and capacity. Then Audrey looked at Wesley. He knew what was coming. He'd known from the moment he saw Audrey's eyes track across the room the same way his did, with the same instinct for who in a space needed something and whether it was possible to provide it. He was already reaching for the extra chair at the adjacent table before she said anything. Audrey got up. She walked across the diner to the young woman with her sleeping boy, and she stood there, 9 years old in her yellow dress with her direct, undeflectable gaze. and she said something Wesley couldn't hear from across the room. The woman looked at her, surprised. Audrey gestured toward the table. The woman looked across the room at the table, at the adults watching, at the space being offered, and her face did something complicated and then something simpler, which was the face of someone accepting something they needed and hadn't expected. She came over. Wesley pulled the chair out. The boy woke up slightly on his mother's shoulder, looked around with the unfocused assessment of the recently asleep, and found Tessa looking at him from across the table. "Hi," Tessa said. The boy considered. "Hi." "We have milkshakes," Tessa said. "They're debating which flavor is better, but actually you can get whatever you want." The boy looked at his mother. She nodded. "Strawberry," the boy said. "That's a third data point," Audrey said, sitting back down. "For the record." "It helps the chocolate side," Tessa told her. "It helps the non-vanilla side," Audrey said, "which is all I've been arguing." Celeste squeezed Wesley's hand across the table. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because the moment didn't need language, was in fact better without it. The corner table with its flickering light and cracked vinyl and the accumulated coffee rings of 4 years of solitary Thursday evenings, now full. Not just with people, but with the specific warm noise of people who had chosen each other, people who were still figuring out what choosing each other meant, and doing it anyway, in the ordinary imperfect way that real things got done. Wesley Kane had spent a long time believing that the right way to honor the people you'd lost was to hold the space for them, to keep the chair empty, to maintain the geography of absence as a form of fidelity. He understood now that fidelity didn't require stillness, that you could carry someone with you into motion, that moving forward didn't mean moving away. It meant carrying more, differently, with the accumulated weight of everything that had made you who you were by the time the next thing arrived. Lauren was in this. In the way Tessa laughed, in the way Wesley had spent 4 years learning to be alone without becoming someone who could only be alone, in the Thursday evenings at Manny's that had kept a door open long enough for a 9-year-old with a stuffed rabbit to walk through it. Daniel was in this too. In Audrey's directness, in the intellectual rigor she brought to milkshake data and floor plan optimization, and the question of whether the asteroid's angle of impact had been decisive. In the foundation bearing his family name, in the way Celeste had learned to rebuild without forgetting what she was rebuilding from. The people they'd loved and lost were not absent from this table. They were present in the people their love had made. That was not a comfort exactly. It didn't resolve the loss or make it smaller or cleaner. The losses were what they were, abrupt and permanent and non-negotiable. The kind of facts that didn't yield to any amount of processing or time into something other than what they were. Wesley wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and he didn't think pretending was what the moment called for anyway. What the moment called for was a short stack and a vanilla milkshake. He was apparently going to be teased about for the foreseeable future, and a table full of people who had found their way to each other through the specific, improbable sequence of events that begins with a child deciding that a stranger looks safe and ends, 1 year later, with the stranger understanding for the first time in a long time what it means to be found. Darlene came back to take the young woman's order. The boy said strawberry again, firmly, in case there had been any ambiguity the first time. Audrey said, "See?" to Tessa. Tessa said, "1 data point." Audrey said, "It's trending." Outside, the June evening was doing what June evenings in New York did. Warm and slightly soft, the city in its best seasonal argument for itself. People on the sidewalk at the loose and easy pace of a warm night with nowhere urgent to be. Inside Manny's, the corner table with the flickering light was full. Wesley Kane, who had once been a lieutenant and had become a maintenance worker and was now becoming something he didn't have a clean word for yet. Husband, stepfather, the kind of man who pulled chairs out before he was asked, drank his vanilla milkshake and listened to his daughters argue and felt the particular weight of a full life, which is different from a happy life in that it contains more, costs more, and means more than happiness alone can account for. His wife was sitting across from him. His daughters were arguing productively. The strangers at the table were becoming less strange. And in the warm, shabby, imperfect corner of an ordinary diner on an ordinary June evening, Wesley Kane was exactly where the slightly open door had brought him. He wouldn't have planned it. He was grateful he hadn't needed to.